Hello, welcome to this week's Awakening Game. The series of Awakening Games that we're in now began when we were listening to Resta Burnham's song, The Voice Beyond Time. And of course, when we were listening to that song, we were practicing tuning out the story in the foreground so we could listen to the voice that was in the background of the song. It's kind of funny because Resta once gave me the lyrics to all of her songs. So I have the lyrics to all of her songs. And when you look at The Voice Beyond Time, she doesn't put the lyrics, right? She just says, what you hear is what you hear. No lyrics. So this is true. What we hear is what we hear. And what we're doing in this series of games is we're learning to hear better that which we don't usually hear. We've been looking at what I've been calling the backseat driver, which is really the ego subconscious. Except as we've seen, it's not really fully subconscious. For the typical human, it's more barely conscious. It's like just inside the conscious mind, just enough that we believe what it's saying without noticing we're believing what it's saying. Now we're going to look at another level of back, which I'm going to call the Navigator. A Course in Miracles calls it the Holy Spirit. I usually call it spiritual intuition or inner spiritual wisdom. But I'm calling it the Navigator because this voice or this sense knows better for us what to do or how to be than does the ego subconscious, and better than does the story or the chatter in the mind that's more conscious. It's really, if we're going to be listening, it's best to listen back to this level. When we were listening to Resta's song, The Voice Beyond Time, the voice we were tuning into was this level, the Navigator. Let me share my screen with you, show you something before I go further into the game. This is just a little diagram I did. But notice this is the conscious mind. The conscious mind is where the foreground is happening. So both the perception of the world and the chatter in the mind. Very conscious. We're very aware of this. Then we have the backseat driver or the ego subconscious, which, as I mentioned, is reaching into consciousness. Notice there's little spaces here, right? It does come up into consciousness, but it barely comes up into consciousness. We believe it, and then it's subconscious again. And what we've been doing with these games is bringing this level, the ego subconscious or the backseat driver, more into the conscious mind so that we can be aware of those messages and discern whether it's really anything we want to listen to or not. And hopefully we're looking at these messages, we're saying, I see you or I hear you. You're the backseat driver. And realizing we don't have to listen to these messages. We don't have to accept these messages as true. The next level, which we're going to start practicing listening to this week, is clarity or the Navigator. Again, this is the level that knows best what's best for us, better than the conscious foreground story, better than the ego subconscious. But you can kind of see that this is even further from the conscious mind than the ego subconscious is, which means the best way to hear or recognize the clarity is first to remove the obstacle of the ego subconscious. If you take the ego subconscious out of it, then clarity is closer to the conscious mind. So that's what we're going to be doing in this game. We're going to first recognize the backseat driver, realize we're not interested in its message, and then listen again, listen further back for the message of clarity. So what do the messages of clarity sound like, so you know what you're listening for? Resta didn't give us any lyrics. She said you hear what you hear, but I'm going to give you some examples of what I've heard from clarity when I listen back. So I remember when I first started listening for clarity, the message I heard a lot was relax. I didn't realize how constricted I was, how contracted I was, how worried I was, how controlling I was, right? It was always telling me to relax. I also used to often hear breathe, right? Breathe. I would also hear messages like, it's okay. Let it be. Or let him be, or let her be, meaning allow them to be as they are. I would also hear messages that told me to look, pay attention. And what it wanted me to look and pay attention to is what was going on with me. It wanted me to be very, very aware of what was going on with me. I heard messages like, you are loved, you are perfect, I heard messages that told me things like guilt is a false belief. It taught me to look at guilt and realize I only felt guilty because I was believing the judgment that was coming from the ego subconscious. And that without believing the messages from the ego subconscious, there would not be a feeling of guilt. It taught me that peace is present as what I am. And that whenever I'm not experiencing peace as present, it's because I was listening to the ego subconscious, believing a story. It taught me to accept things as they are. It even taught me that wanting things to be different than they are is crazy. It's a proposition you can't ever win, because things are as they are. It taught me to pay attention to how I feel, so that I would notice, for example, that I feel better when I accept, and that I don't feel as well when I judge. It taught me that fear, let me say this way, it taught me that I believed fear protected me. And it taught me to notice that fear doesn't protect me, that almost always the story that fear is telling doesn't actually happen, that fear is just a negative imagination believed, and that it doesn't have any protective value at all, so that I could let go of believing fear. It taught me rest, accept, and trust when emotions are strong, that I rest the story in the mind, accept the emotion, and trust this is healing. It taught me the difference between discernment and judgment. It taught me that pride was a false face covering unworthiness, and that whenever I noticed myself feeling proud, it was better to let that go, because by feeling proud, I was still keeping unworthiness in place. I'll stop there, but it taught me a lot, this clarity. You can see why I call it the Navigator. It was moving me to a truer state of knowing myself than the one that I was in when I was listening to the egoic subconscious and the foreground stories. So let me demonstrate the game for you. This game, again, we start by acknowledging the ego subconscious, letting it go, and then asking for the clarity. So, for example, imagine that there's this foreground story, and I'm noticing again that my emotions aren't the best. I don't feel well. They're negative. I'm stressed, or I'm angry, or I want to run and hide. I'm embarrassed, whatever. So the first thing I want to do is look and see what is the ego subconscious message. What is the backseat driver saying? Maybe I'll quickly look and I'll hear, you're a loser. That's really what's going on here. You're a loser. So the first thing I want to do is look at that message. And I taught one method of looking at it last week. I see you, you're the backseat driver. You can also just shorten that to, I see that thought, and then acknowledge, but I'm not interested in that thought. I see that thought, I'm a loser, but I'm not interested in that thought. And then ask, what do you have for me? But you're speaking to clarity. You're speaking to inner wisdom. You're speaking to the Navigator. What do you have for me? And then whatever comes up from the Navigator is what you listen to, what you follow, what you do, what you believe, what you trust. So a story going on in the foreground, I'm feeling a lot of stress. I look to see what I'm feeling. There's that message, you're a loser. They're all going to see you're a loser. You're going to fail at this. They're all going to see you're a loser. I see that. I see those thoughts. But I am not interested in those thoughts. That's not where I want to place my believing attention. What do you have for me? And what might arise is breathe. Trust all is well. And just take this next step. Right? Just take this next step, whatever it is that has to be done next. I can't really tell you what you're going to hear from the Navigator, from the inner clarity. It's just like Resta says here in the lyrics, what you hear is what you hear. But this week, what we're going to do is we're going to practice asking. Whenever there's emotions going on here that are not peace or not contentment, first check for what the backseat driver message is saying. Acknowledge that. Acknowledge your genuine lack of interest in it. And then ask the Navigator, what do you have for me? And see what arises. That's the game. Play it well. And I'll see you next week. Bye.